Welcome to My Jewish Learning. We are so thrilled to welcome Sam Apple, the author, here today to discuss his new book, Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. And we are also lucky to have Andrew Silow-Carroll here to moderate an interview. And so you can hear more about the book through this conversation. So Andrew Silow-Carroll is editor-in-chief of the New York Jewish Week and senior editor of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And Sam Apple is on the faculty of the MA in Science Writing and MA in Writing programs at Johns Hopkins. Prior to his recent arrival at Johns Hopkins, Apple taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. He holds a BA in English and Creative Writing from the University of Michigan and an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from Columbia University. Apple's first book, Schlepping Through the Alps, was a finalist for the PEN America Award for a first work of nonfiction and the Koret Award for Young Writers on Jewish Themes. So we are very excited to hear about your newest book. Just to let everyone know, this session is being recorded if you wanted to watch it again later or share it with someone that you know. So Andrew, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to see Sam again. Sam and I go back a ways. I think I was back at the Forward when you came to me with a crazy story about an Austrian shepherd who sings Yiddish to his sheep. And I think we published that story, and that became your first book.
Yeah, you played a very important role in my career.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Always happy, I shepherded your career to make a pun. But it's funny when I think about that period, I think about that book, which the book was lighthearted. It was thick, it was dense, but it was lighthearted. It was life affirming. Where Otto Warburg's story, the subject of your new book, is a much darker tale in some ways, even though it does have some life-affirming elements. So let me just start out by asking how you got onto the story of Otto Warburg, this famed German scientist who has a very, let's say, complicated relationship with the Nazi government during the war.
Sure. It really started with my interest in metabolism and how metabolism and our diets relate to disease. So I had been reading about diabetes and obesity and diets, and I became interested in how cancer was also connected to these metabolic diseases. I hadn't really known anything about that, and I was very surprised because I always thought that cancer was sort of a separate realm from diabetes and obesity. So I became interested in that connection, and as I was reading about it, I found an article. There was just one line in the article said in 1923, a German scientist had discovered that cancer cells take up nutrients in an unusual way. It said his name was Otto Warburg, and I Googled him and started to read about his story, and knew very quickly that I wanted to write about him because, as we'll talk about more, he lived an incredible life. And, as a science writer, that's really what I look for is a great character, first and foremost. A way to tell a story about science through the lens of one particular character. And I don't think I could find anybody more interesting to me than Otto Warburg.
Right. So this is first part of the 20th century. He's, I guess we know the Warburg name from his famous American cousins who are Jewish, or certainly, at the time. But Otto did not identify himself as Jewish. Is that correct?
Right. He, he was a cousin of the famous Warburgs in America and Germany. And, his father was born Jewish. So he knew of his Jewish heritage, but like many German Jews, he was fully assimilated and didn't really, participate in Jewish life. Of course, if you're growing up with the name Warburg in Germany or in most places in the world in the early 20th century, you're aware of your Jewish identity, whether you want to be or not. It's, I looked at some old records that, on when he would travel on a ship in the 1920s, and it would still be stamped next to his name, Judah, Jew. So you couldn't escape it, but he wasn't, a part of Jewish life, I would say.
Right. We'll get to some of that later because that's gonna really matter by the time we hit the 1930s. But Otto's he wins the Nobel Prize in medicine as early as 1931. Before the Nazi era, and that again his contributions were in cellular metabolism and cellular respiration. So by the time of the war, he's a famous scientist. But even before then, he's a very proud German. He has a war record. He fought in an elite unit of some sort back in World War I.
Yeah, again, he didn't really identify as Jewish, but he was very similar to other German Jews, and I think wanting and feeling like he needed to prove his patriotism. And in addition to being Jewish, he was a homosexual. He wasn't out, but as close to out as one can be. So he had all these aspects of his identity in German life that would be questioned or that he had to hide. So I think part of joining the military was about proving himself. And it's amazing how many Jews really lined up to fight that war. They had early Zionists coming back from Palestine to fight for the Germans in 1914. And by the end of the war, 2% of all German Jews died fighting for the quote unquote fatherland. So he wasn't alone in that, but he didn't have to go. He was already past military age at that point. But he went and he served in a cavalry unit. He was a great lover of horses, and he was at times at the front lines. He earned an Iron Cross. But one of the amazing parts about this story is that his parents were desperate for him to come home, and his father, Emil Warburg, was a famous physicist, and they were writing letters and trying to get him out. And eventually, his father, who was friends with Einstein, asked Einstein to write a letter, and Einstein writes to him and says, "You got to come back. You're too important for science." And he finally listens to Einstein and returns. So, Einstein may well have saved his life. Shortly after he returned, he makes his incredible cancer discovery. So, Einstein has an important role in this story.
Sure. So cancer at this time is becoming it's not a new disease, but it suddenly becomes a really important national and international goal to try to conquer. And this, we're talking about what the teens, late 20s. Tell me about what's happening in the world of cancer research and where he fits in.
Sure. It's not, a new disease, but it is changing a lot. It's becoming much more common. This starts in the mid to late 19th century and continues well into the 20th century, where rates are going up and up, far outstripping population growth. And in Germany in particular, it becomes something of a national panic. And Warburg, his father had made great discoveries in physics. He grew up in a home full of Nobel Prize winners, Einstein, Max Planck. These were the people, in his living room when he was growing up. So he sees himself as being in that group and wanting to make his own great discovery. And he decides it's going to be in the realm of cancer because, a great German in his mind solves a great disease. He idolized Robert Koch, the famous bacteriologist. And so he sets out to cure cancer because it's the disease of the moment, and nobody understands why it's increasing, and people are desperate for something new.
So where are his various perches? Where is he doing his research? Because I know at some point he's going to become head of his own fiefdom.
Yeah.
But how does he get from there, which is called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, if I'm correct? And then how does he get there from, I guess, a university setting, a lab setting, and what's he in control of during the 1920s and early 30s?
So shortly before World War I, he's appointed to this Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which is
that early.
Most prestigious scientific establishment in Germany, which is at the time the world's leading scientific country. So he's already at the top of the scientific world, and the fact that he stepped away to fight in World War I is even more remarkable because of that. And when he comes back, Germany has changed, and he doesn't have all the equipment and whatnot that he needs. But, eventually he sort of makes these great discoveries, and the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Foundation, actually offers to build him his own institute, which is kind of remarkable because, we had just fought a war with Germany relatively recently, and, it's a huge investment in German science. But, they're also searching for, a cancer cure and believe that Warburg is the best hope. So, they put up over $600,000, which is, in 1920s money, to build him his own institute in 1931. And, he's sort of an aristocrat by nature, and insists that it not look like a scientific institute, but like a sort of a countryside manor. And it's, really an incredible building that he moves into and continues to do research in, for the rest of his life, actually.
That's Dahlem? That's the neighborhood outside of...
It's a neighborhood in Southwest Berlin. And the idea was to sort of create, like they sometimes call it the Oxford of Germany, to create a series of institutes for Germany's best scientists, where they don't have to worry about any academic concerns. They have all the money they need, and they can, just focus on what they want to focus on.
Right. Not the most pleasant man in the world, right? Tell me a little bit about his personality and how he treated fellow scientists.
Yeah, he was an awful guy in a lot of ways. I was drawn to him as a character, but I could certainly see and appreciate his flaws. Everybody could. He was a great narcissist. My book is full of examples. One of my favorites is when he found out he was going to win the Nobel Prize in 1931. His first response was, "It's about time." And he actually had a fair point, because he really should have won it years earlier for his cancer research. He ended up winning it for his research on how cells breathe. At one point, he was asked to take part in a photograph with other scientists, and he said he didn't want to do it because they're beneath him, and all the others in the group were Nobel Prize winners. So you get the idea. And there's hundreds of examples like this. But what really surprised me about it, I've read about other narcissists. Can think of quite a few great narcissists in history, but I don't think they're usually geniuses in the way that he was. You expect that personality trait would go with a certain kind of foolishness, and he could be foolish at times, but he was truly brilliant, scientific genius. So it just surprises me that those two qualities could coexist.
So the Nazis are come to power. He's already at the top of his game, I guess, as a scientist. Let's first ask the question, because I think this will give some context for what happens next. Was he a Nazi sympathizer?
No, he despised the Nazi. I think he hated the Nazis as much as anyone. But people might hear that and assume that therefore he's a great moral figure. And unfortunately, he didn't despise them for all the right reasons. He certainly, was outraged by their crimes. But I think that what really bothered him most of all is that they were interrupting his research. He couldn't stand for anybody to interrupt him and to tell him what to do. And, he was an aristocrat. He thought of them as thugs and lowlifes, and how dare they tell me what to do. So I think that was, it's always about himself first and foremost. And he did protect some Jewish researchers, and, doesn't have a terrible moral record, but it's very clear that it was driven by his narcissism. One of the most shocking things about the story, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is what I found so fascinating is that he's not only Jewish by Nazi definitions, and not only living with his homosexual partner. So he's clearly one of the most vulnerable people imaginable in Nazi Germany, but instead, when 1933 comes around and the Nazis start to harass him and ask for his proof of Aryan descent, he provokes them at every opportunity, refuses to give the Hitler salute, won't put up the Nazi flag, screams at the brown shirts that come and try to, get his workers to go to Nazi marches. So, it's just incredible that he survived, given, how many times he provoked the Nazis. And, so maybe we'll talk about more. He almost didn't survive. It really sort of came to a head in 1941. But, he was reckless, and he got away with it ultimately, I think, because, the Nazis were so interested in his cancer science.
Yeah, talk about that a little. It's the Nazis and their interest in cancer. And this is actually an obsession of Hitler's. I think you talk a little about Hitler's mother. She was a cancer victim, and so let's talk. There's two ways to talk about cancer when it comes to Hitler, which is like literally and figuratively. Let's talk the literal part. How did it become a Nazi obsession to find a cure for cancer?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of layers to it. I mean, the first one is what we already talked about, which is that, there was a sort of a German-wide panic about cancer because it had grown so much more common. And the Germans had been at the forefront of overcoming infectious diseases, identifying the bacteria that cause tuberculosis and anthrax and so on. So, they were intent on defeating cancer. That was the next goal. So the German scientific establishment was focused on this, but it was particularly of interest to Hitler and many of the leading Nazis, but I'll focus on Hitler for now, because his mother had died of breast cancer, and he was a teenager and had been absolutely distraught, had been at her bedside as she was dying and tried to help with experimental treatments. And he was working together, this is in Austria, of course, with a Jewish doctor who cared for his mother. And Hitler seemed to really like and respect this doctor. The doctor cared for Hitler as well when he was a child. And, so Hitler had been by the bedside as this doctor is applying these painful treatments to his mother. She's apparently in excruciating pain. And he witnesses all this. And, who knows how it plays into all the various, psychoses that emerge. But he is, for the rest of his life after this experience, terrified of cancer. He suffers from stomach cramps throughout his life and believes that they're caused by cancer. I mean, that there are signs of cancer. So his obsession continues to grow, even, to the point where he's obsessed with like lobsters and crabs and shellfish. And the word in German comes, back to the ancient Greek is krebs, which is the same word for crab in German. So some historians think that even his shellfish interest has to do with this weird cancer fixation. That's speculative, but it played a huge role in his psyche.
And even more than, I was going to say, now the figurative part is Nazism. I think you have someone quoting Nazism as a sort of national hygiene project, that, the Jews and gays, they represented a cancer on the country. So it almost was like medicalizing this awful, this genocidal program.
Yeah, that I learned a lot about this story from a really remarkable book called The Nazi War on Cancer by Robert Proctor, a Stanford historian. And, as Proctor explains it, and I really think he's right about this, is a good way to understand Nazism in general is as a sort of a hygiene project, where they have this obsession with purity and anything that's considered impure, be it a disease like cancer, and cancer at the time was very thought of an impurity, and or Jews are another impurity, and it all sort of fit together in their mind as a cleansing project, and Jews were a part of that. And when you read Mein Kampf and Hitler's speeches, really remarkable. He uses the cancer metaphor over and over again, which a lot of people have done. Even today, we use cancer as a metaphor, so it's not surprising that he uses it. But when you see him talking about Jews and cancer, you almost get this feeling that the metaphor is sort of shrinking away. It's becoming literal. He's talking about Jews popping out of growths, and he said, like, you look inside the growth and out comes a kike, and so on and so forth, all these horrible things. But you see how this got worked together in his mind. And one striking aspect of it is he talks about, he over and over again, he uses this idea that in the same way that if you have a deadly cancer, you can't sit back and just let it grow. You have to take a chance. You have to try to attack it. In the same way, Germany can't relax. We have to move forward and fight, even if it means taking a risk. And, if you look back to this Jewish doctor had told him, about this experimental treatment, and Hitler decided to move forward with it and take the risk with his mother. And it clearly weighed on his psyche. And you hear that in his discussions of Germany in Mein Kampf. It's really striking.
Right. So to bring it back to Otto, I think there's a point, and I think you pulled together a couple of historical threads to prove it, that Hitler may have intervened personally to keep him from being, well, let's back up 1 second. the race science in Germany, which you go into in some detail, is so upsetting and so disturbing. The careful, deciding who's a quarter Jewish, 1/8 Jewish, 1/16 Jewish. So Otto, by all accounts, qualifies as Jewish under the Nazi racial laws, and yet you have some sense that Hitler might have intervened to protect him and his cancer research.
Yeah, yeah. So his definition as a Jew changed as the Nazi regulations changed. So initially, he's just lumped with all Jews. Then they come up with this special category for half Jews. So it gets very complicated, and that was a lot. One of the more interesting things to me, growing up, I learned about the Holocaust, and I remember, learning from a young age that you had one grandparent who was Jewish. You were Jewish, and that was it. But they actually, based on the number of grandparents who were Jewish, you had sort of different rules applied to you. So he was a half Jew, and was in a slightly better situation than a full Jew, but in a worse situation than a quarter Jew. I mean, it's all just completely crazy. But I think one of the most remarkable things I discovered in researching this book was that Warburg's luck seems to have run out in 1941, and he's called to Hitler's chancellery, the Nazi headquarters in Berlin, and he meets with Victor Brack, one of the worst Nazis. He's the guy who designed the euthanasia project, which sort of started all the mass killings. And he's been evicted. He's told he has to leave his institute. And he's got a lot of enemies in German science that want to get rid of him. And so he sits down with Victor Brack, and he's told he's going to be allowed to survive so long as he focuses on cancer. And Victor Brack wasn't in a position to do this himself. And I discovered in Himmler's diary that it shows on this day, June 21st, 1941, he meets with Brack to discuss the fate of Warburg. So it was clearly that the top Nazis were focused on this. But the thing that really surprised me was the date, June 21st, 1941. Later that night, at dawn the next morning, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa. It's the biggest military invasion in history. The tanks start rolling eastward into Soviet territory. So, they're gambling the entire Nazi project. And only hours before, they're focused on Warburg. And I think there's good reason to think that Hitler himself was involved, because if you look in Goebbels' diary later that night, Goebbels records what he and Hitler talk about, and they're talking about cancer research. Warburg's name isn't in the diary, but even hours before they're going to announce Operation Barbarossa, that's why they were meeting, to talk about how they're going to tell the German people that they're invading the Soviet Union. They take a break to discuss cancer research. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And it wasn't just Hitler. All the top Nazis were obsessed with the disease.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you suggested Otto stood up to Nazis only to the degree that they were going to affect him personally. What was his record in terms of protecting other Jews, whether in his lab or in his circle?
Yeah, it was, in 1933 is when everything, the Nazis take over, and almost all of Warburg's colleagues, start to flee or plan to flee. And he does invite Hans Krebs, who was one of his famous students, to come and work with him. Krebs is fired and eventually flees to England. And he protected, he had a Jewish researcher in his lab he protected. But there was another guy in his lab he had just hired who he let go. And he said it was for various reasons, but it looked suspicious. And, you look at the two cases, the Jewish guy he protected was a really important person in his lab. He needed him for his science. The Jewish guy that he let go, was a new hire he didn't really need. So you get a sense that, when his own interests were, considered, that it was always his own interest that came first. And the one guy that he did fire, he remained friends with for life. So I don't know that, he had already fired the guy once before. It's a complicated story. Yeah. So it's hard to say, but he was certainly not a moral champion. He was isolated in his institute. He wasn't following world news for a lot of the time. And, he just wanted to be left alone. They called him the Emperor of Dahlem. His institute was like his palace, and he didn't want anybody to interfere with it. And, the more they harassed him, the more stubborn he became. And he said, I was here before Hitler, and, I'm going to outlast him, and, no one's going to throw me out. And that was his concern. And one of the most striking parts that I didn't tell you after 1941, when they decided to let him live if he focuses on cancer, then in the following years, bombs start to fall near his institute. In the middle of the war, late 1943, they move him to a new institute. They have to refurbish the Seaside Palace. This is at a time when, you're not even allowed to use gasoline. Everything is going towards the war effort. They take time out to build Warburg, this new institute. It's really incredible.
Since this is the Nazi era and he's a science, there's a debate about Nazi science and whether society can derive a benefit from their, the inhumane experimentation that they did. Is there any indication that Warburg's science is tainted?
No, I don't think there is. You could say that it's tainted insofar as he could have left in 1933. By the end, it was too late to leave. And he stayed and he made discoveries that were very important for cancer and our general understanding of enzymes work in the cell. So, maybe in some way you could say it's tainted, but not in the sense that he was contributing to the Nazi cause in any way.
Right, and it was no human experimentation and some of those horrors.
Like that, but people that in other Kaiser Wilhelm institutes, that was going on. After the war, he actually served on a committee and was a witness and called out some of the scientists who were Nazis. So that was another positive role that he played. Is after the war, he helped identify some of the Nazis in the Kaiser Wilhelm Society.
Right. And I think you alluded before. He felt the Nazi thing would blow over at some point. That's not a strong defense of his behavior, but he certainly did not think they would have a hold on the country that they continue to have. Yeah,
I actually think it's, his decision to stay, I think, is defensible. It's hard to understand from our current perspective, but in 1933, he's just won the Nobel Prize. He has a gorgeous institute that was built specifically for him in 1931. And he believes, like so many Germans, that it's going to be 6 months to a year, the Nazis are going to be gone. His cousin, Max Warburg, says, all we have to do is give Hitler enough rope to hang himself. And so Warburg wants to stay. But the thing that really surprised me and I found upsetting, I hadn't really realized until I worked on this book, is that leaving was a humiliating act for these scientists. To flee was to sort of accept the Nazi narrative that they're lower and lesser and don't belong in Germany. So Warburg was a person who could never, accept that kind of humiliation. So, now from historical perspective, it seems that was the obvious thing to do, but it was extremely painful for German scientists to leave. And they also would end up in much lesser positions. They were at the top of the scientific world in Germany, and then they'd go and, find a small lab in Illinois or Wisconsin. And, it's great, but, he thought of himself as a king. And he said at one point, anybody else can find a new institute, but a king needs a kingdom. And he had his kingdom and he wasn't going to leave it. So a lot of things I don't respect about him, but I understand why he stayed.
Did he keep up a relationship with Einstein during the war, after the war?
Yeah. He stayed in touch with Einstein and, was a friend. They had dinner together. They had only one fight that I could find evidence of, which kind of amused me. After Warburg won the Nobel Prize, he was really excited that he was going to use some of the money to, he collected antique furniture and he wanted to buy a horse, a certain type of horse. And Einstein made sort of an offhand remark like, scientists shouldn't be so focused on material things. And Warburg, stewed about it for weeks, I think, because he just, he was obsessed with material things. And, Einstein probably hadn't thought much of the comment, but Warburg was devastated. But he really idolized Einstein and all of his science, even though he worked in the realm of biology. He was always looking at it from the perspective of a physicist and, how a cancer cell uses energy. And that's, what really made him different from other cancer scientists then and to some extent now.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that science, because I think a major part of your book is trying to reclaim some of the discoveries that made him famous and then fell out of favor. So let's first talk about that. After the war and up until, almost your book project, what's Warburg's reputation in the worlds of science, in the world of cancer research? We know names like Koch. I'm familiar with his name, but Warburg's not so much. What happened in that period?
Yeah, so he's world famous. In 1936, the New York Times is writing an article like, Warburg's fate is in jeopardy, and he's known around the world. And then after the war, he starts to fade away, and part of it is that people suspected that if he stayed in Nazi Germany, maybe he collaborated in some way. And part of it was that I mentioned before that he was just incredibly narcissistic and arrogant. So he was always sort of dismissing other scientists, and said that his own cancer discovery was the only thing that mattered. Everything else was garbage. And so he made enemies easily. So that didn't help. But the real shift was that Warburg had understood cancer as a problem of metabolism, the problem of how our cells take up nutrients and break them down for energy. And at some level, cancer has to be about metabolism because it's about growth, and you need nutrients and energy for growth. But in the 1970s, there's this big shift where they start identifying specific genes that cause cancer, and that really moves all the attention away from metabolism. You can think of it as like, genes are about information and metabolism is about energy. And both are part of the cancer story, but people just lost all focus on the energy part, on the nutrient part. And the amazing thing to me was how quickly it happened. By the 1980s, Warburg is disappearing from textbooks. This is somebody who made just a fundamental discovery that, there's debates about why cancer cells eat in an unusual way, but everybody agreed that they do and that it's really important, and yet it got completely lost. And in 2000, there's a very famous paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, which sort of identifies the 6 fundamental things that happen in cancer. It doesn't mention Warburg science. In 2006, a famous cancer textbook comes out, doesn't mention Warburg. The Emperor of All Maladies, a wonderful book in many ways, but doesn't mention Warburg. So he just disappears. And it's really incredible because what he discovered is that cancer cells overeat glucose and sort of break it down in an unusual way. And if you do a PET scan, it's one of the most fundamental tests. That's what it looks at. It just looks at where in the body are your cells taking up more glucose. That's where you have cancer. So at the same time that this was a fundamental diagnostic test staring science right in the face, everybody just forgot about Warburg. And then in the late 90s, it starts to come back. And if you like, I can talk about that as well.
Let's get that. I want to get to that in one sec. I do want to ask though, did his reputation suffer from his wartime record or lack thereof? Was there a sense that he was tainted by the Nazi enterprise? And a good question is, did his views on the Nazis, someone asked this in the chat room, did his views on the Nazis evolve afterwards? Did he, where was he after the war?
Yeah. So after the war, he doesn't talk about it very much. In that way, he's like a lot of Germans where, they moved on all too quickly. And he's inviting, in the 1950s, he's inviting people to his institute, which he calls the Palace of Cell Physiology. And, he's not talking about the Holocaust. The one person who visited said, the runes are still smoking, and Warburg's talking about his photosynthesis debate that he's having at the time. So he was just, again, right after the war, he did serve on some committees. So, he didn't ignore it completely, but, he was very typical of a German and sort of wanting to look forward and to reestablish German science. But the really interesting thing to me was, a conversation I had with Robert Weinberg, who is one of the most important cancer scientists of the last, 50 years. And he made a lot of these, I talked about the genetic discoveries in cancer, hugely important stuff. And Weinberg made some of those discoveries, really important scientist. And he's the one who he co-authored this 2000 paper that I alluded to. He edited this 2006 textbook, which ignores Warburg. And he told me that it really, he hated Warburg because he had stayed in Germany. He had lost a lot of relatives. Weinberg's family, is a famous German Jewish family as well. And so it clearly played a role. The suspicion played a role. And it's not totally, I mean, it's unfair in that Warburg hated the Nazis and didn't work with them, but it's not totally unfair in that, he could have been more dignified. He could have left when he didn't. So one of the things that really surprised me is as late as 1997, the first scientist, a guy named Chi Van Dang, a great cancer scientist, makes this discovery, which refocuses attention on Warburg. And a Jewish scientist takes him aside and says, just so you know, you might not want to talk about Warburg. You're stepping into some really sort of, complicated political stuff here. I don't know if you want to get into that, but, surprised me that it was, 1997 that conversation was continuing. In Weinberg, just a couple of years ago, told me all this stuff. So, it still lingers.
When did Warburg die?
Died in 1970.
At what age?
He was 87.
87, never left Germany, and he was pretty much at the Institute until the end of his life?
Yeah. He has, after the war, he has this period where the Institute is taken over by the American military, which is in, Berlin. But he gets his Institute back in the 1950s and stays there until the end of his life. He had actually tried to find, in 1945, he was sort of a wandering scientist for a couple of years and trying to find a place, and nobody really wanted him at that point. So, it was a great humbling, which he never really internalized.
Someone in the chat asks, did the Americans ever try to recruit him the way they recruited, the rocket scientists and some of the other famous Nazi scientists?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I tried to dig into that, and I thought they must have done more because the Russians were very clearly trying to recruit him. Shortly after the war, he's driving around in a new car that was given to him by the Russians, and some of his equipment was still in Germany, Soviet territory. So he's sort of going back and forth between the two. And he actually publishes a paper in the Soviet Union in 1945, which I thought was very interesting. So the Russians made the bigger effort, but at one point, at least one point, I found a document that showed the Americans were trying to get him involved in one particular project, and they sat him down for an interview, and I found the assessment by the American military interviewer, and they said that he was so arrogant and had spoken in such a wild way about his enemies that they didn't think he was a good person to work with. So it sort of surprised me that they, given his extraordinary accomplishments, that they would dismiss him just based on that. And I feel like if I had another 5 years, I might turn up more American recruitment, but I couldn't find anything really concrete on that.
Right. So what are the implications for cancer right now? You write about this in your book. What about Otto's work is being recovered, and where could it concretely lead to advances in cancer?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, in 1997, the cancer scientists are only focused on how these genetic pathways cause cancer and cancer genes. They start to see that these mutations, that they had always understood that these mutations cause cancer because they cause a cell to divide and divide and divide. That's what cancer is. But they found that these same mutations actually cause a cancer cell to eat and eat and eat. And so, it added the second layer. They turn on what's called the Warburg Effect, which is a cell moving from using oxygen to burn nutrients to just taking up a lot of glucose and fermenting it. It's just fermentation. It's the exact same thing, really, that microorganisms do. It's how we get beer and wine and bread and cheese and yogurt. That's what cancer cells do. And they found that these same mutations were causing cancer cells to ferment glucose, to do the Warburg effect. So, they started to think that not only is this part of cancer, but it might be actually the most fundamental part, because to grow, the way organisms work, the way cells work, you grow when you have nutrients. So that it looks like the nutrients sort of inspire the growth, and that it's the most fundamental step. So that's part of the story, and it's leading to, I wouldn't say there are any extraordinary cancer drugs that have emerged from this. Well, there actually are a few, but only for very specific types of cancer. So I'm still hopeful that this new understanding is going to lead to new drugs, but where I see the great promise is in the context of diet, because if the cancer cell is eating in this unusual way, it raises the obvious question: does that have anything to do with how we eat? Is there a connection? And I think there is. And, in the last chapters of my book, I make this argument. The way I like to think about it is that for the last, 100 years, there have been two sort of parallel scientific approaches to cancer. One is what's going on inside the cancer cell. Is it genes? Is it the way a cell ferments glucose? And the other one is epidemiology, population studies. Do people that have a certain diet get cancer more often than others? And do people who are heavier get cancer more than others? So both of these conversations have been going on, really since the 19th century, but it happens at almost the same time in the late 1990s, at almost the same time that they're rediscovering Warburg and how a cancer cell eats. All these other researchers, these epidemiologists, are making connections between obesity and cancer. And so, one group is talking about how we eat, and the other group is talking about how a cancer cell eats, and it happens almost at the same time. And the question for me is, what's the connection here? And I think there's a surprisingly clear answer, which you have to read the book to get the full answer. But it seems that the really striking thing is that if you put a microorganism on a piece of bread, it's just going to eat and eat and eat and grow and grow and grow. But human cells have an extra layer, all animal cells, which is, hormonal layer. We don't just grow, we have to be told to, our cells have to be told to eat by this hormone insulin. And this hormone insulin, when it's in, excessive levels, also causes obesity. So the hypothesis is that the same hormone that's causing us to put on weight is also telling cancer cells to overeat glucose. And that's driving both effects at the same time. So, it gets into some complicated science, but that's really, what I think is the key to the story, that it's not necessarily that obesity is causing cancer, but this hormone insulin is causing obesity and causing cancer cells to eat in the way that Warburg identified. And, it's still controversial science in a lot of ways, and not everybody agrees with this, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence. And I'll let you talk as well, but the final step in this sort of thought process is, okay, if it's elevated insulin, if it's, what we call insulin resistance, then what is it in our diet that's responsible for that? And that's why my last chapter is about sugar, because I think dietary sugar is the key driver.
Mm-hmm. Your book's been out a short time, but have you, has it been out there long enough to get some responses from the scientific community? Either people praising you for raising this, or saying, this is, these theories are as crackpot as Warburg, or something like that.
I'm waiting for the angry emails. I'm sure they'll be coming. I'm a journalist, so I don't say anything about cancer science that is not, based on something that a scientist told me. I synthesize their arguments and I put it into my own words in my own argument, but it's all based on not only scientists, but actually some of the leading cancer scientists in the country, people who are heads of the major cancer institutes. So I don't think that, probably I think the part about insulin is not that controversial. I think the sugar part is more controversial, and it raises all sorts of questions that are hard to answer. How much sugar is too much? And is it just about drinking sugar, or does it matter if you eat sugar? So it gets controversial, but the one thing that I have been called out on Twitter, which I think is fair and a good point, which is that, I have to be careful when I'm talking about avoiding sugar or avoiding carbohydrates. It's in the context of prevention, not in the context of treatment. There are a lot of people experimenting with ketogenic diets in the context of treatment, and there may be some hope for that being one more tool that oncologists can use, but we don't know yet. It's too early to know. So I'm really focused on prevention. As I see it, elevated insulin as a carcinogen, there's a lot of evidence for that. And if you have a carcinogen, the logical thing to do is to get it down. And it so happens that, avoiding sugar is one way to do that.
Right. Tell me about your research. I'm just, as a journalist, I'm interested in the archives you either had to access, some of the living people you interviewed. Tell me a little bit about your, and how long this took.
Sure. I worked on the book for 5 years, and it emerged from a New York Times Magazine article that I had started the year before. So really 6 years. And I really, I don't have any training as a historian, so I sort of had to figure it out as I went. And I really loved, searching for things and finding clues, and had some really kind of exciting finds. One of Warburg's colleagues worked at the National Cancer Institute in DC, and his son is still alive. And he invited me to, I found him and I said, "Do you have any papers?" And he said, "Well, yeah, you should see my attic." And I get to his house, and it hasn't, with all due respect, it hasn't been cleaned out in a while. So he's got just these huge stacks of papers, and I found some really dramatic things in this kind of dusty attic. So there was a lot of just the fun of hunting for documents. But then I visited archives in Germany, but so many of the papers are spread out across the world, and I was able to get access just by sort of, contacting people and saying, "Would you mind scanning?" They charge you a small fee, but really this book could not have been written without a team of archivists around the world. And, I guess all historians know how this works, but this is new to me. Wow, these people will just give you whatever you want. You just have to ask them. So, I dedicated my book to everybody who helped, because there are literally, hundreds of people that contributed to the research along the way.
That's great. I'm going to check to see if, if people have questions, definitely put them into the chat room. I'm also curious about his partner of many. We haven't spoken about his partner, but I guess they were lifelong partners. What was his name, and what was his fate?
Yeah, his name was Jacob Heiss, and it's really one of the things I liked most about Warburg is that, he didn't try to hide his homosexuality. He couldn't really be out at the time, but they were as open as you could be. They tried, when Warburg went on a trip, he insisted that, his partner be given a ticket as well. They went to the opera together, and it's a really wonderful love story in a lot of ways. But Heiss was sort of an aggressive guy. He was bigger than Warburg, and he sort of also served the role of bodyguard. Warburg hated to be interrupted, and so Heiss would chase away the media, or, at one point there's a story about Heiss knocking cameras out of people's hands. So he sort of played that role for Warburg, and he cooked for him and he cleaned. But what really surprised me, actually, when I was digging through these letters in this attic in Washington, D.C., I actually found a lot of letters from Heiss, who had been corresponding with this scientist as well, this American scientist. And Heiss had taken over sort of the management of the lab after the war, and actually knew the science quite well. And, there's all this discussion of chemistry. I was amazed how much Heiss knew. I guess you spend your whole life with Warburg and you're a smart guy, you learn a lot of chemistry. But, he was a really important figure in Warburg's life. And, Warburg did, as you can imagine, have pressure from his family and his mother to marry a woman.
Right.
He wisely, resisted the pressure.
Mm-hmm. Did he have siblings, Warburg?
Yeah, he had 3 sisters, and he was particularly close with one of them, Lotte, and her diary was actually one of the single most important documents that I had. He didn't leave many notes, but in many personal notes. He left a lot of scientific notes, of course, but Lotte's diary was really incredible. She was a writer, and has all these extraordinary stories. So a lot of the stuff I talk about comes from her diary.
Right. What was their fate during the war?
Her Lotte left Germany, and she survived. He had one sister who actually survived in Germany, was married to kind of a prominent German scientist, and seems to have evaded persecution. But other Warburg cousins, some left, but some did die in the camps. I don't know if Warburg was aware of it at the time. But yeah, it's very complicated. Each individual in the family seems to have had, a different fate. But Lotte, was very early in sort of identifying, Warburg was saying to her that, the Nazis are going to go away. And she's like, no, this is real. You've got to move. So she picked up and escaped, and he stayed.
What can we see? What's his legacy? Is kind of his material legacy in Germany today? Are there things named for him? Are there libraries or museums that are devoted to his work?
Yeah, I mean, by the end of his career, he was already starting, the scientific sort of tides were changing. He was, they were already losing interest in him in Germany as well. But he, is well regarded in Germany, and his institute is now the archives of what's now called the Max Planck Society. And what I like about that is, a lot of historians go to those archives now and find evidence of, the society's role in the Nazi years. And so his institute is now being used to sort of find evidence against his many enemies at the time. So I think he would like that. But there was also in the early post-war years, I think that he served some propaganda use for the West German government, saying, here's somebody who's a Jew who survived, and we've given him his institute back. So, it's all very complicated, but he's not a household name in Germany, but there's an Otto Warburg Award for chemistry and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier growing up Jewish and what you learned about the Holocaust. Your 5 years, delving deeply into this time period. How did you approach that as someone who's Jewish, and what kind of issues or dilemmas did it raise for you?
Yeah, it was difficult. It's certainly, my first book deals with the Holocaust to some extent. So, it wasn't entirely to me, but, I never really engaged with firsthand sources in the way of a historian might. So it's kind of shocking just, holding in my hand some of these documents, which you see people signing off with Heil Hitler, and you see the swastika imprints on the documents. It really was chilling in a lot of ways. It was also, I wrote this book, over the last 5 years, and there was, so much going on in American politics and the rise of the far right, and it was impossible, not to hear the echoes, and to, some of the stuff that I read in Nazi documents. I could very easily see how that ideology has been morphed and come out in terms of modern, far right politics. So it was difficult in a lot of ways, and certainly, was sort of changed my perspective on, everything that was going on in contemporary politics as well.
Well, I would recommend this. It's a bit of a pot boiler. I mean, it's a tremendous biography. It has the science, if you're interested in the science, but just I do recommend it just as a really interesting and compelling read about a very dark time. So most of all, I just want to thank you for the 5 years you put into it, because it was a very enlightening book, and I urge people to get their copy of Ravenous soon. And thanks again, Sam. It's really been it's been terrific talking to you again.
Thank you. I really appreciate the kind words and your interest. And this was great. Thank you.